Okay, so here we are. It is January 28th, and this is our bi-weekly policy and action update. A couple of really exciting things happened this week that I'm excited to share with you. First one is my delightful little state budget, fiscal year 23 state budget chart. We can now fill in our first number. So on Wednesday, Governor Baker released his budget proposal and recommended $20.4 million for the Mass Cultural Council. Again, this is the largest sort of annual investment in arts and culture is through our state arts agency. And so Governor Baker kicked it off with 20.4 million. So that is an interesting thing, right? And I woke up, I saw that news and smiled. Why, you might ask? Because that is an increase for our dear governor. So here's a little graph that sort of points out how Governor Baker's proposed budgets have allocated to the Mass Cultural Council through his entire administration, through 2 terms as governor. And this last one represents a 25% increase from last year. So that's great news. And we want to thank Governor Baker. We yesterday in the reminder for this event, we put in a little note that you can click on an action alert to send a note to Governor Baker saying thank you very much. It is important not just to let our public officials know when we are dissatisfied or when we want something, but also when we are satisfied and we are thankful for something. And this is a moment to say thank you. But this is literally like the football kickoff at the beginning of the Super Bowl. We have a long game to go. There are halftime shows in between. I will stop with that metaphor now. So here's the other thing, just to put in a little bit of context, right? Governor Baker's budget, here's Governor Baker's fiscal year 22 budget, which is the budget we're in now, and his recommendation for fiscal year 23. You can see that there's about a little over a $2 billion increase between the 2 budgets. And here's where the Mass Cultural Council budget stacks up, right? And this is, in order to get this graph to fit, this is log. This is the numbering is log. So this is, logarithm form. So we're sort of truncating the bar graph here. But to make my point, last year, his recommendation was 0.036% of the total budget, and this year it is 0.042%. So it's certainly a success, but there are a lot of other things in the annual state budget, and so this is just to put it a little bit in perspective. What is going to happen next? I'm going to go back to my top slide, is that the Joint Ways and Means Committees are going to run their hearings, right? They are going to ask the public, they're going to ask all of the state agencies and all of the secretaries to and cabinet officials to testify and share why their budget requests are what they are. And at that point, the Mass Cultural Council and Executive Director Michael J. Bobbitt will also testify. They are still negotiating what their final proposed number is. And as soon as we know that, we will support them in that effort and share that with all of you. And we will all support that effort, right? And then after that, House Ways and Means will release their budget, and there'll be budget debate in the House and so on. Okay, so moving on. The other thing that happened this week, there's 2 other things. So there's 3 things that happened this week. So the next one that I want to talk about is the Votes Act. So yesterday, the Votes Act was voted on by the House. This is a vote to really focus on keeping elections accessible and fair, and free and fair elections. It includes a number of different components. And this was the original bill, which included same-day voting registration, enshrining vote by mail, making sure that that's not something that just happens during a pandemic, but happens all the time. Having early, extended in-person voting periods. A little fix to the automatic voter registration, which happens in Massachusetts. So you don't have to opt out excuse me, so you don't have to opt into automatic voter registration when you go to the RMV, but in fact, you have to opt out. It actually increases the number of people who register to vote. Implementing the electronic registration information center, which a number of other states in the nation have, and then a significant number of jail-based voting reforms. So this was a piece of legislation that was really spearheaded by Common Cause Massachusetts. The ACLU was involved, Mass Vote was involved, the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts was also involved, and so was Mass Creative and Create the Vote, right? So here's what happened yesterday. So it passed the House 124 to 34, but it did not include same-day voter registration. So the next step, right, it already passed this out of the Senate. So the next step is going to be the conference committee. And as soon as those conference committee members are appointed, there'll be an opportunity to advocate that same-day voting, you know, to make sure that the provisions that we think are going to be really important continue to be in there. And then it'll move to a vote, right? So we got this question this week, so I thought it would be a good point to address it, which is, why is Create the Vote and why is Mass Creative involved in voting legislation? In 2020, the Create the Vote campaign actually focused not on engaging candidates with the needs of the creative sector, but about placing cultural institutions and artists in a space that we know that they live, which is being trusted messengers of communication in their communities, to help make sure that people had the information that they needed to vote and vote safely in the election. And this has always been a part of the work of Create the Vote and Mass Creative, which is making sure that more people show up to vote. When we vote, when we make sure our voices are heard and participate in decision making, we can affect what the decisions are. And that includes elections, both ballot questions and elections for office. And so that's why we decided that it was important for us to stand with our colleagues at Common Cause, the ACLU, and the League of Women Voters, and as well as Mass Vote, to say that, yes, we agree with this piece of legislation and we want to see it passed. So that is what is kind of going on with that piece of legislation. The final thing that happened this week is something that we haven't talked a lot about, but is the supplemental budget. So strap on your like fun, wonky, nerdy hats, because this is a fun ride. So we spend a lot of time talking about the annual budget, right? And that happens sort of, you know, starting now, and it'll go through spring and into the summer. But that's like all of us who've participated in budgeting processes for our businesses or our arts and cultural organization. That's like a plan. Like that's what we think we can raise. It's what we think things are going to cost. But we all know that throughout the year, you have to make adjustments, and so does the state. And that's where the supplemental budget comes into play. They happen probably about 4 times a year, maybe a little bit more. And they are sort of teed off by the governor, who is monitoring all of the expenses, right? As the executive branch, they're running government. And the governor says, hey, we gotta reconcile these accounts, or we need more money for this piece, or we need less money, let's move it into this. And the governor will file a supplemental budget, and then the House and the Senate will take it up. This is also an interesting place where sometimes language fixes for legislation or bills or laws that had been needed for a while, but can be tucked in, and you can kind of move them pretty quickly without like a lot of hullabaloo or a lot of attention paid. So they are, in fact, really interesting documents to read through. What was interesting about this in particular for us is what you see on the screen, right? So the House passed their version, and then the Senate got ready to pass their version, and Senator Sonia Chang Diaz filed Amendment 18, which is a vaccine awareness and education grant program. And this is going to be, her proposal is that the Department of Public Health would run it in consultation with the Mass Cultural Council, and it would create a grant program for arts organizations and artists and culture bearers to create art that promotes vaccine awareness and education, right? And gets us to the public health outcomes that we want to see. Again, this is the arts playing their role as a trusted communicator of information in our civic space and in our communities. And it's really exciting to see Senator Sonia Chang Diaz identify that and file this bill. Excuse me, not this bill, excuse me, this amendment. So what happened? Well, it was adopted. And there were a number of folks who co-sponsored the amendment. They are on this list. Take a moment. Do you see your senator on this list? If you do, this is another opportunity to say thank you. This is not like there wasn't a press release about this amendment. There wasn't a lot of noise or fuss made about this amendment, but it's actually a big deal. And we should thank our lawmakers, specifically the champions on this list, who said, yeah, we want to see that happen, right? So it does matter if you take a moment to say, hey, I saw this happened this week. I saw that you co-sponsored Amendment 18. If your senator is Sonia Chang Diaz, I'm so glad you filed this amendment. I think that this is an important move forward. And I really, thank you for doing so. The supplemental budget will now go into a conference committee and have to be negotiated, just like any piece of legislation. And so we're also, as soon as those members are appointed, we'll do a little advocacy to make sure that this amendment, which is in the Senate version but not in the House, ends up being retained for the final version. Okay, so couple of housekeeping things. I'm sure many of you attended the session that the Mass Cultural Council held earlier this week. There were 250 individuals who attended, and this was a session where Executive Director Michael Bobbitt and the chair of the Grants Committee, Joanne Davis, were seeking input from the field about how to allocate and how to spend the $60 million that was allocated in the ARPA spending plan, right? Or ARPA spending bill. Again, what's really exciting about this is they actually want to know from the field what would be the best use of that money. While that virtual session has passed, there is still an opportunity to submit written comments, and I would highly, highly encourage you to do so. Here are a couple of things to consider, and I attended that virtual session, and there was some really exciting conversation happening, a lot of really great ideas percolating. Some guardrails to just consider, right? ARPA funds have to be spent through December 31st of 2024, and there's no sort of replenishment right now. So for the most part, when the legislation was crafted, legislators were really, really concerned about creating new programs that would have to be sort of perennially funded or annually funded, excuse me. So this, while it would be great to say, let's create a whole new grant program to fund artists in mentorship programs for, from now until eternity, we're looking for the point of this legislation is short-term, one-time impactful efforts, right? The other thing is that in the legislation that was passed, the legislators made it really clear that they want to see equitable distribution of this funding. And there is some specifics about making sure to reach communities that have been historically underinvested in, as well as have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. So again, every comment is welcome, as I understand it, from the Mass Cultural Council, but in terms of making sure that you're thinking about this and helping you with your thinking, there are some points to be made. Okay. The other thing is while you're busy writing comments there, maybe you could share your opinion with us. So today at 5 p.m., we're going to close our training survey. We've received a little, just under 80 responses, which is really great for us, but we certainly would like to hear more. And this is really a quick, it takes less than 5 minutes survey to say, what are the things you want to learn more about this year? How both topics, as well as workings of government, as well as what skills do you want to develop, and what's the best way for you to learn. We really are going to take this to heart, and it'll help us craft our next series of training. So please consider filling that out, and more importantly, sharing it with your networks. It would be so awesome if y'all posted to your Facebooks or to your social media platforms and said, hey, take this by 5 p.m. today. All right. Finally, we will be back together in 2 weeks, next Friday on the 11th. I am so excited to see you then, and thank you for joining us this morning. I'm just going to quickly run through the chat to see, excuse me, if there are, Okay. Yeah. So Nikki, so the legislation says it has to be done by calendar year 2014. The LAA, the local arts agency grants that were received may have a different timeline. That is the only question that I see in the chat, but one more. And obviously go by the paperwork that you received when you received your grant. That's really great news. I didn't include this in the slide, but the NEA did announce their grants. So in the ARPA spending bill, the NEA received funding. 60% went to states and regional NEA agencies. So money went to the Mass Cultural Council, which they used to replenish the relief fund that had been stood up in December of 2020. In 2020, no, so 20. Now I'm forgetting dates. The relief fund that had been set up in March 2020. At the end, yeah, March of 2020. Thank you, March of 2020, and that many folks had not been able to get. There was about $10 million of relief fund and only $30 million of requests. So they used that money for that. And then the other piece, so the NEA just announced their grants that are direct grants to organizations. They posted that on the list on their website. There's a pretty strong diversity of organizations in Massachusetts that received support. It varies in budget size, in discipline, and geography, which is exciting to see. All right, well, thank you all for your time this morning, and have a great weekend. I hope you stay warm and safe, particularly with the snow. All right, see ya.